At 16:20 on 22nd of November 1975, the light was already failing over South Armagh. Civil twilight at that latitude falls around 4 in the afternoon in late November. The fields and hedgerows at Drummuckavall, 2 miles southeast of Crossmaglen, a borderland of drumlins and damp pasture pressing against County Louth, were losing their definition. Shapes blurring, distances compressing. The kind of light that makes surveillance harder and movement easier. Fusilier Peter McDonald was on watch, prone behind a light machine gun, watching south toward the stream that ran along the border. Fusilier Michael Sampson was finishing a meal. Fusilier James Duncan was on his back, resting. Lance Corporal Paul Johnson was alive. Then up to 12 gunmen opened fire from 2 positions inside the Republic of Ireland, and within seconds, 3 of those 4 men were dead. Duncan was 19 years old from Oldham. MacDonald was 19 from Manchester. Sampson was 20. The 4 of them were 9 Platoon, C Company, 3rd Battalion, the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. Riflemen on a 4-month roulement tour of South Armagh that had begun on 16th of August 1975. Not special forces, not specialist surveillance operators. A half-section from a rifle company, deployed to a hillside they had been given no specialist preparation to hold. The date of the attack, Saturday 22nd of November 1975, is confirmed by the Ministry of Defence casualty records, the Cain conflict database at Ulster University, Hansard 2 days later, the regimental archive, and every published historical account. At least one named commenter has disputed this, asserting 23rd November. No corroborating source for the alternative date has been found. This isn't a story about an ambush. Ambushes in South Armagh in 1975 weren't unusual. 14 members of the security forces had already been killed in the area that year alone. What separates Drumakaval from the rest is the British Army's own subsequent assessment of why it happened, and then what the Army did about it for the rest of the campaign. South Armagh's geography was a structural problem that the British Army had been failing to solve since 1969. The border with the Republic ran in irregular curves through agricultural land, along drainage channels, field boundaries, country roads. There was no defensible line. IRA units based south of the border could observe targets on the northern side, plan attacks, cross at unguarded points, engage, and withdraw before any conventional response could be organised. The intelligence advantage was almost entirely with the IRA. Every farmhouse, every local face, every car that didn't belong, these were reported up an information chain that ran into the Republic and looped back with operational targeting. Crossmaglen sat at the operational centre of the problem. 2 miles north of Drumakaval, the town square was overlooked from multiple directions and visible from across the border. The Joint Army and RUC base on the square was mortared, sniped at, and the scene of repeated IRA operations throughout the Troubles. 8 miles north of Crossmaglen by road was Newtown Hamilton, another station on the 3rd Battalion's operational area. The ground between those 2 points, South Armagh's heart, was, by late 1975, essentially ceded to the IRA for movement purposes. The decision to move troops by helicopter rather than road had already been reached. The roads belonged to the IRA. The skies were contested but navigable. That shift mattered operationally because it concentrated the Army's permanent positions and limited its ability to move quickly on the ground when something went wrong. The South Armagh Brigade of the Provisional IRA was organised into 2 battalions, one around Jonesborough, one around Crossmaglen. By the end of the Troubles, the brigade would be responsible for the highest number of security force deaths in any IRA brigade area during the Troubles. By 1975, it had already established a discipline that conventional infantry found almost impossible to counter. Total familiarity with every field, every farm building, every face that was out of place. Drummuckavall specifically had been a target before. On 13th of August 1974, 15 months before the ambush, a provisional IRA remote-controlled bomb destroyed a British Army observation post at the same location. 2 soldiers of 45 Commando Royal Marines died. Corporal Dennis Leach, aged 24, and Marine Michael Sampson, aged 19. 2 others were injured. The bomb weighed approximately 200 pounds. The IRA knew the ground at Drummuckavall. The Army knew the IRA knew it. A position at Drummuckavall in November 1975 wasn't a new approach to the problem. It was a repetition of one that had already produced 2 dead Marines at the exact same spot. The tasking in November 1975 was specific. Harnden's account, the most detailed published reconstruction of this event, identifies the mission directly. The observation post was established to watch a bomb which had been discovered on the border. 4 men walked out from Crossmaglen before first light on 21st of November 1975 and settled into a position on a slope behind bushes overlooking the stream, 50 yards north of the Republic. Coordinates placed Drumakaval at approximately 54.05 degrees north, 6.57 degrees west, close to where an unnamed road crosses a culverted stream on the border to join the Dundalk Road. The position was in sight of houses across the border on the Republic side. They had their weapons, they had a radio, they had the training and the equipment of a section of British infantry. What they didn't have was the training or the equipment the task actually required. The distinction matters, and it has to be stated precisely. A standard British infantry section in 1975 was trained for conventional military operations, section attacks, fire and manoeuvre, urban patrolling, vehicle checkpoint procedures, cordon and search. In Northern Ireland, rulement battalions received pre-deployment training that covered some specific local skills: the current threat picture, rules of engagement, the particular terrain of their area of operations. The 3rd Battalion's South Armagh tour of 1975, August to December, was a rulement deployment in a high-threat environment. The men were prepared for that environment as riflemen. But the demands of a static, rural, close observation post were categorically different from rifleman skills. Sustained concealment across multiple days, camouflage discipline that could defeat observation from within 50 yards in agricultural terrain where local eyes were watching every disturbed piece of ground. Communications redundancy so that the loss of one piece of equipment didn't silence the position entirely. Dispersed positioning, separate arcs of observation, mutual support, the ability for one pair of men to react while the other continued to observe. These weren't skills that standard pre-deployment training for an infantry battalion produced. They required a specialist preparation. In November 1975, that specialist preparation had not been systematically built into the structure of units deploying to the border. In his filmed account for the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, published on the regimental YouTube channel on the 8th of November 2023, narrated by Charlie Collicutt and produced by Big Ears Productions, and viewed over 110,000 times since, Lance Corporal Paul Johnson described what the preparation for the OP had looked like. The section received a brief instructional session before going out. Not specialist OP training. A preparation appropriate to infantry on a rulement tour, not a course designed to keep men alive in a concealed position within observation range of an IRA safe house in South Armagh. He described going out without the proper equipment for the task. He said they did their best with what they had. The British Army's follow-up report on the contact reached very similar conclusions, arrived at from the other direction. Toby Harnden secured access to that report's findings during his research for Bandit country. The findings are specific. The OP had been bunched, all 4 men on a single position, rather than a dispersed layout with separate arcs of observation and mutual support. The position was within sight of several houses across the border in the Republic. None of the soldiers was wearing a combat jacket or head net. A ground sheet had been flapping in the breeze. The report's observation on vegetation was precise. Remember, in South Armagh, it's no use removing local vegetation to provide cover. Locals will soon spot that. And then its final verdict. The casualties had been the result of bad camouflage, wrong routine, and incorrect OP layout. Every item on that list describes a failure of specialist preparation that standard infantry training didn't provide. The bunching was standard infantry OP layout, applied without modification to a context where it was immediately lethal. The visibility from the nearby houses was a product of selecting a position with the tools and knowledge of a rifle section rather than a covert observation team. The camouflage failure wasn't a failure of effort. The men were doing what they had been trained to do. It was a failure of the gap between what standard British infantry camouflage and concealment training produced and what close observation in South Armagh actually demanded. None of the report's findings describe cowardice. None describe incompetence in the conventional sense. They describe the difference between the job and the preparation the organisation had given 4 men to do it. There was a communications failure compounding the tactical one. The radio was knocked out by the first burst of fire. The communications equipment was disabled by the first burst of fire. If the Army's own communications systems were this vulnerable to a single point of failure, the counter was redundancy. A backup route, a second set, a procedure for restoring comms under fire. Specialist teams operating in South Armagh later in the campaign carried that redundancy as a minimum standard. The Fusiliers in November 1975 weren't operating with redundant equipment. When the shooting started, the OP had no way to call for help. The 36 hours before the attack are a lesson in how exposure accumulates before it becomes catastrophic. The 4 men were in position by 200 on 21st of November. The position was almost certainly compromised within hours. The historical record is consistent on this. Locals spotted the OP shortly after it was established and informed the IRA. This isn't a criticism of the Fusiliers. In South Armagh in 1975, a 4-man position within sight of houses across the border, established in darkness but visible through daylight, in a townland where the IRA's information network reached every lane and farmyard, was an exposed position from the moment the sun came up on 21st of November. The brigade had 15 months of operational memory of this specific ground since the 1974 Marine deaths. They knew what an Army OP at Drummuckavall looked like. The routine ran as it was supposed to. 1 man watching front, 1 watching rear, 1 resting, 1 eating, changing over every couple of hours. Standard infantry observation post drill. It maintained alertness. It maintained the discipline of a section doing what it had been trained to do. What it didn't do, what it couldn't do with the camouflage, the layout, the ground sheet, the absence of specialist training in concealment techniques specific to this kind of farmland, was maintain the invisibility the position required. At some point on 22nd of November, before 1620, a warning came in. Johnson's account describes it. A report that someone from a nearby property, known to the patrol as the Big White House, known to the patrol as an IRA safe house, had been coming outside and observing the general area around the OP's position. Not looking directly at them, looking around. That qualification is a professional distinction. It describes reconnaissance that has already confirmed the target and is now establishing the details: movements, routine, positions, sightlines. The man outside the house wasn't curious, he was timing. The warning, as Johnson describes it, arrived without time attached to it. The mission was active, the bomb still needed watching. No source suggests that a withdrawal protocol was in place or that the option to relocate was realistically available in the time that remained between the warning and the shooting. The section stayed. When the light fell to the point where the fields south of the border disappeared into dusk, 4 British soldiers were still in the same position they had occupied for 36 hours, on ground the IRA had known about for most of that time, with a ground sheet in the wind and no head nets, and a bunched layout and a single-point communications system. The attack began at 16:20. Up to 12 gunmen moved to 2 firing positions inside the Republic of Ireland and opened fire. A later inquest confirmed those positions were south of the border. The attack was coordinated. 2 separate arcs converging on a known target using automatic weapons at last light from ground the attackers knew and the defenders couldn't reach. The IRA had assembled at a size that overwhelmed any realistic defensive response from 4 men in a compromised, static position. The first burst was immediate and devastating. McDonald was at the light machine gun, the one man on active watch. Sampson was finishing a meal. Duncan was on his back. The fire caught them where they were, in the single-site configuration the Army's own report would subsequently describe as incorrectly laid out. 3 Fusiliers died in the opening seconds. Johnson survived the first burst. He was prone, and he stayed prone. The IRA called on him to surrender. He refused. He returned fire. A second call to surrender was made, followed by more automatic fire. Johnson was hit in the wrist, side, and back. 3 wounds, none immediately fatal. The IRA unit withdrew across the border. As they went, Johnson could hear them. His account records it. "Up the RA!" and laughing. He lay still. 3 men were dead around him. The radio was silent. No call had gone out, and none was going to go out. One of the AR-15 rifles used in the attack was subsequently found to have been used in another operation, the attack on the Tullyvallen Orange Hall on 1 September 1975, which had killed 5 civilians. The South Armagh Brigade recycled its weapons as methodically as it recycled its intelligence. The same unit that had been observing the border at Drummuckavall for 36 hours had a documented operational history stretching back through the summer. The immediate aftermath was a test of improvisation under catastrophic injury. Johnson crawled approximately 25 yards toward a nearby road. His account describes the intention: to stop a passing vehicle, at gunpoint if required, and reach Crossmaglen. He had his rifle. He had 3 wounds. The alternative was to lie on a hillside where 12 gunmen had been within the last few minutes, with no communications, no support, and no signal that anyone knew what had happened. What shortened the wait was a coincidence of proximity. A military convoy was travelling north, a couple of miles up the road, when the sustained automatic fire from the direction of Drumakaval was heard. They had not been sent. They were simply in the area. The sound of a contact in South Armagh in 1975 was recognisable for what it was, and it was the kind of sound that brought reactions. The C Company reaction force arrived by helicopter. Johnson was extracted and transported to Musgrave Park Hospital in Belfast, the military hospital that received the Army's serious casualties from the Troubles throughout Operation Banner's run. He survived his wounds. Duncan, McDonald and Sampson were recovered from the hillside. Within 48 hours, the deaths were in Hansard. A House of Commons debate on the 24th of November 1975 names the casualties. A security debate on the 4th of December records the context. 3 soldiers killed in a covert army observation post near Crossmaglen, 1 seriously injured, and 14 members of the security forces dead in South Armagh by that point in the year alone. The scale of attrition in one county in one calendar year, stated plainly in Parliament 2 weeks after the event, didn't immediately produce structural reform at the operational level. It produced first a name. Secretary of State for Northern Ireland Merlin Rees issued his characterisation of South Armagh as Bandit country shortly after the Drummuckavall attack. The phrase had circulated informally before its official adoption, but stating it from a ministerial platform gave it a different weight. It was accurate as a description of a situation the army had been living inside for years. It was also the beginning, imprecise and political though it was, of an acknowledgement that the situation required something different from what the existing structure had been providing. The Army's follow-up report on the Drumakaval contact, cited by Harnden in Bandit country, arrived at conclusions that the official rhetoric couldn't fully contain. Bad camouflage, wrong routine, incorrect OP layout. The report's guidance on vegetation removal, that in South Armagh disturbing local cover draws attention rather than defeating observation, was operationally exact. It described a problem that experienced soldiers could, in principle, have diagnosed from first principles. What it wasn't was part of the formal preparation that a Roulemont infantry battalion received before deploying to the border. The gap between what the report found and what the pre-deployment training had included was the institutional failure, stated in official language. The first institutional response was the SAS deployment. In January 1976, Prime Minister Harold Wilson publicly acknowledged the presence of D Squadron 22 SAS at Bessbrook Mill in South Armagh. Mark Urban, in Big Boys Rules, places the first 12 SAS personnel in the area from January 1976. The connection to the events of the preceding months is direct. The Drumakaval killings in November 1975 and then the Kingsmill massacre on the 5th of January 1976, 10 Protestant workmen shot dead at a roadside near Bessbrook, together formed the political basis for an overt change of approach. 3 dead Fusiliers in a bunched position with a flapping ground sheet had already established, in the Army's own internal assessment, that normal soldiering and fieldcraft skills were proving inadequate in South Armagh. Kingsmill provided the political cover to say so publicly and act on it. The SAS operated in ways that a rifle company section couldn't. They were trained in close observation, covert movement, and specialist camouflage. They had redundant communications. They understood how to position themselves for mutual support and undetected observation in agricultural terrain. They were, in operational terms, what the border required. But the regiment had finite numbers, and as SAS assets were drawn into operations across the rest of Northern Ireland through 1976 and 1977, there was a systematic requirement for regular soldiers to be trained to fill the same function. The Drumakaval report had described the capability gap. The SAS deployment demonstrated one way to close it. The question was how to scale that capability through the regular army. Major General Dick Trant provided the structural answer from 1977. Trant established close observation platoons, COPs, as small, specialist-trained teams conducting long-range and close surveillance in South Armagh and elsewhere. Harnden's account quotes the institutional reasoning directly. The SAS was a finite resource and was soon being used throughout Northern Ireland, so there was a need for regular soldiers to be trained to operate covertly. This led to the establishment of close observation platoons by Major General Dick Trant in 1977. The COPs were tasked by RUC Special Branch rather than by the Army chain of command, and they operated in plain clothes or specialist camouflage, DPM coveralls and concealment equipment of a different order from anything the 1975 Fusiliers carried, with redundant communications, dispersed positions, and trained mutual support built into every deployment. The capabilities that COPs carried as a minimum standard were drawn directly from the failure taxonomy the Drummuckavall report had produced. Dispersed layout rather than a single site position. Specialist camouflage that could defeat observation from close range in agricultural terrain. Communications redundancy so that a single burst of gunfire couldn't silence the entire position. Hard routine. No food preparation during observation periods, no movement that could be detected from the houses across the border. Mutual support positions so that if one pair of men were compromised, the other pair had a line of fire and a way out. Every one of those standards was either absent or inadequate in the Drummuckavall OP of November 1975, and the Army's own report said so. The COPs weren't invulnerable. The Glasdrumman ambush of 1981 killed members of a close observation team, and Operation Conservation in 1990 resulted in further COP casualties in South Armagh. But they operated with a different set of tools against a different baseline of preparation. The gap that had killed Duncan, McDonald and Sampson wasn't permitted to persist unchanged. It was catalogued, reported on and addressed. Ralph Brooker served in the Royal Hampshire Regiment. His military service in Northern Ireland, specifically Fermanagh and the South Armagh border area, is independently confirmed by his appearance as a named guest on the Good Listener podcast in October 2024, in an episode titled Patrolling Bandit Country, South Armagh and Fermanagh IRA, Mortar Attacks and Mines, hosted by John Haddon. Brooker, a practitioner with direct experience of the same operational environment, stated in his public commentary on the Fusiliers' filmed account that the whole rural OP ethos changed as a result of Drummuckavall. Ricky DePledge, another named veteran who served in the same period, stated that the Drummuckavall incident was taught on the Close Observation Platoon course, that the men from 9 Platoon became the case study on what standard infantry OP procedure produced when substituted for specialist covert observation in South Armagh. Neither claim constitutes an archived doctrinal document. No formal COP course handbook that names Drummuckavall in its title has been located in the accessible public record. What Brooker and DePledge describe is consistent with the narrative and institutional record, that the ambush entered the professional memory of those trained in specialist covert observation as the example of what happens when the wrong preparation is applied to the wrong task on the wrong ground. The Fusiliers' own film about the ambush runs 11 minutes and 12 seconds. It has been viewed over 110,000 times since its publication in November 2023. It stops at the wounding. It does not address what changed. It wasn't made to address what changed. It was made to record Johnson's testimony and honour the 3 men who died. The doctrinal aftermath, the reason the story matters beyond the regimental record, had to be assembled from Harnden, from urban, from practitioner testimony, from the Army's own institutional literature, from a Defence Technical Information Centre document, and from the follow-up report that concluded bad camouflage, wrong routine, incorrect OP layout. It's all there in the published record, if you look for it. Paul Johnson gave his account years after the ambush. He was asked whether he had made mistakes that day. He said yes, he had. He was the OP commander. The position was bunched. The camouflage was inadequate. The routine was wrong for the environment. The ground sheet was in the wind. He carried all of that. Then he said the thing that the Army's follow-up report had reached from a different angle but never stated so directly. The report concluded bad camouflage, wrong routine, incorrect OP layout. A technical verdict on a technical failure, distributing culpability across procedure and position, assigning no institutional responsibility to the decision to send untrained men to do a specialist job. Johnson's version was more direct. In his account, he said that he had clearly made mistakes, but that the big mistake had been sending them down there. He had been given a brief instructional session before going out. He had gone out without the right equipment for the task. He had been commanding 3 men who were 19 and 20 years old on a hillside in the most lethal operating environment in the United Kingdom, on ground the IRA had known about for 36 hours. Against an active service unit of up to 12 men who had been watching the position through that entire time. The Army's own report subsequently confirmed that every failure it identified at the position was a failure of specialist preparation that standard infantry training didn't provide. The big mistake was sending them there. Fusilier James Duncan, Fusilier Peter McDonald, Fusilier Michael Sampson. Duncan was 19 from Oldham. MacDonald was 19 from Manchester. Sampson was 20. They are buried in different corners of England and the Isle of Man. They were from 9 Platoon, C Company, 3rd Battalion, the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, on a roulement tour of South Armagh that had started on 16th of August 1975 and was scheduled to end on 16th December. They weren't special forces. They weren't specialists of any kind. They were riflemen. Major General Dick Trant began establishing close observation platoons in 1977. The British Army's own internal assessment of Drummuckavall, bad camouflage, wrong routine, incorrect OP layout, was the first draft of the specification those platoons were built to meet. Every patrol that went out to watch a border in South Armagh after 1977 went out with different training, different equipment and different doctrine than the 4 men from 9 Platoon carried onto that hillside on the night of 21st of November 1975. That isn't a consolation. It's the record.